I actually think this part of the conference is just as important as the conference we just attended, because it doesn't matter what we discover if that doesn't go out into the community. And that's the only way we're going to see that tick down, in cancer statistics in terms of death and outcomes for prostate cancer, is for people to know about it. And I want to give a special shout out to my friends from Columbus, Ohio, where I was born and raised. And I'm going back there next month to see my mother. And so it's great to be around everyone. I just remember when my father was diagnosed with prostate cancer, we felt very much alone. We didn't have this network, and we couldn't figure out how to enroll him in clinical trials. I remember my mom was literally writing to Judah Folkman to see if there's any way my dad could get that kind of treatment. So it's great that we have these networks now, and I'm just so happy to be here. So I'm going to talk to you about clinical trials in prostate cancer, and I have to make a confession. I actually don't run clinical trials, and I wanted to kind of maybe talk more practically from a standpoint of what to think about when your patients are asking you about clinical trials. But this is kind of the roadmap towards hopefully changing practice and delivering cures in prostate cancer. And all of us researchers here at the meeting fit into different parts of this roadmap. For myself in particular, as a urologist and also a clinician scientist, I have a basic and translational research lab, so I'm more down on this part of the spectrum, with the dream of coming up with new ideas and new targets that could eventually be implemented into clinical trials here, which you can see the phases of the clinical trials, and that would lead to change in practice and prolonged life for prostate cancer patients. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, but clinical trials have these different phases. So in order for a drug to get approved, there has to be all of these different phases of clinical trials. And unfortunately, there's no way of skipping them, any of these phases. And that's why it takes so long to get a drug to market. It's because we have to be very careful in, of course, making sure that drug is, first of all, safe, and then secondly, effective. And so, phase one is when you just take a small group of healthy patients, and you give them the drug, and you see if it's safe to give them the drug, and what kind of adverse effects you have. And if you pass phase one, you can go on to phase two, where you take a larger group of patients, and you kind of fool around with the dose a little bit, and you start to look to see if that drug may be effective. And if you pass phase two, you can go on to phase three. This is where you want to do a more randomized trial. You want to take some patients and give them the drug that's active, and other patients and give them the placebo, and test whether or not it's really true. What you think that drug is doing, it's actually doing it. It's not a placebo effect. And finally, you can apply to get review of the FDA and get approval for your drug, so you can actually use it in patient care. And then further down the line, we can do more studies looking at special groups of patients, the effects of the drugs in larger populations, and just continue to look at the safety and efficacy of the drug. So when your patients are thinking about enrolling in clinical trials, obviously it's really great to consider the risks and the benefits, and some of the other presenters have discussed this. So of course the benefits, one of the main benefits is the early access to new treatments that may be effective and may prolong life or improve the quality of life. And so another benefit to patients is that they're playing more of a proactive role in their care. And also another nice thing about being on clinical trials is that there is usually closer follow-up and kind of attention to detail to the care. You're seeing providers more often because they're really checking in with you to make sure that everything's going okay with the trial. So you kind of maybe get some optimal care if you're part of a research protocol. And then, of course, it's the altruistic component. You're really helping other patients potentially in the future by being a part of a trial. But of course, there's always some risk too. So first of all, of course, the new treatment may have serious side effects, or even not so serious side effects, but they're bothersome to you. And then the new treatments may not work, they might not be effective, or they might not actually be better than the standard of care, as we saw some cautionary tales by Dr. Morgans when actually the treatment was worse than the regular standard of care. And then, when you're in a phase 3 trial, you could be randomized to receive placebo and not actually get the active drug. So then, that's always something to consider too, is that, you might not actually get the drug that might be important for prolonging prolonging life and advancing the science. And then it's also sometimes inconvenient. It's the downside of the benefit, which is like you have closer follow-up and maybe closer contact with your healthcare provider, but then you actually have to go in more frequently and maybe get more tests and things like that. So these are the kinds of things that obviously we consider for clinical trials when you're thinking about joining one. So what pushes a patient to participate? So nobody wants to be that guinea pig, right? But I mean, I know in a lot of cases, of course, as we've seen here, sometimes there's no other choice, unfortunately. Until we can cure prostate cancer, especially advanced prostate cancer, you know, we're going to be stuck with doing clinical trials. And so sometimes that's the only option for patients with prostate cancer that has become resistant to all other treatments. Another reason to participate is that, you know, when you're in those randomized trials and you might be getting the placebo or a drug that's more standard of care, there's sometimes you can get into a study that allows crossover, so that if you're not doing well on one group, you could cross over and go to the other treatment side and maybe be offered that experimental drug. So you're not just kind of stuck getting the placebo. And then, you know, another reason to participate is that sometimes a treatment option that's being offered is actually more attractive than the standard of care. Maybe it's a more minimally invasive approach that will allow less potential side effects than the actual standard of care. And then finally, again, the altruism. I mean, I'm always just inspired so much by my patients who are willing to, as I said, I don't do clinical trials, but I do clinical studies. So one of our major interests is studying and understanding and profiling patients with advanced metastatic disease. And so anyone who comes in with newly diagnosed metastatic disease, we ask if we're allowed to take tissue specimens, if they'd be willing to provide additional tissue specimens, so an extra blood draw or even a bone marrow biopsy. And they're willing to do that. They're willing to do that because they see that, you know, in the future that might help somebody else. It's not going to help them, but it might help somebody else. And I don't think we can underestimate that altruistic, that humanity that a lot of our patients provide to us. So how do we find out about clinical trials? So fortunately now there's a lot of resources. You know, the first thing to do and the best thing to do is to talk about it with your healthcare provider, because as you can see, prostate cancer, there's so many types of trials. I mean, like literally probably thousands of trials going on, and it's so dependent on where you are, what stage you are, what type of tumor you might have. It's, you know, there's personalized therapies, so it's really important for your healthcare provider to provide that context, to know that context and understand that, so they can guide you to the appropriate clinical trial if that's something that you're interested in doing or something that maybe you should consider doing at this stage, at your stage in disease. So if your healthcare provider cannot offer that to you, then you should ask them to refer you to someone who can, because there's really no reason why anybody cannot have access to a clinical trial. In addition to talking to your healthcare provider, there are other ways to be informed about clinical trials that are available. So for example, Prostate Cancer Foundation is amazing in their website. You can go pcf.org and there's a clinical trials section. So I actually, in my VA clinic, anybody who's newly diagnosed with prostate cancer, I give them the pcf.org website, because I don't want them doing that Google search and getting the misinformation about prostate cancer. If they're going to look up their disease, I want them to know that they can be assured that they're going to get the right information. So I give them all the pcf.org information. And so that's really great. So they can connect you. You can be connected to clinical trials through the PCF Foundation. I think this is what you can see when you see the pcf.org. There's clinicaltrials.gov, right? So that's the governmental website where all clinical trials are registered, and it's really easily searchable. So you can put in prostate cancer or advanced prostate cancer and anything else, any other keywords, and they'll come up with clinical trials. They'll tell you the status, if they're recruiting, if they're closed, if they're finished, whatever. But you can find out more about clinical trials through that. And then there's something new, actually, a national registry of research volunteers. It's called researchmatch.org. So you can actually be matched to a clinical trial. If you don't have any other resources, if you don't have a healthcare provider that's really giving you the information that you need, you can potentially try a registry like that so that you can be matched and learn and be contacted about potential clinical trials that you're eligible for. So what are the goals of clinical trials? Well, of course, as many clinical trials as there are, each one has different goals, but in general, I think we could agree that generally the goals of clinical trials are to improve screening, diagnosis, and staging in a way that kind of focuses on curative treatments for men that are likely to harbor real aggressive disease. So we want to kind of eliminate over-treatment in men who have more indolent disease and really amplify the treatment when it's necessary in men with more aggressive disease. And then, of course, we want to improve outcomes for men with lethal prostate cancer. So I'm going to go through a few clinical trials that are currently recruiting and open. I'm not advocating for any particular clinical trial. I think I just wanted to highlight some of the trials that are open and that at different stages in the disease that men could consider. So, and just to kind of show you what's out there. So essentially, we can go through different phases, like in the screening phase. So this first slide kind of demonstrates clinical trials that are kind of looking more at screening, kind of what Dr. Chang was talking about earlier in her talk, like the importance of genetic testing and genetic counseling and having and identifying genetic traits in order to amplify screening in men who may be more at risk for developing aggressive disease. So essentially, approximately and Dr. Chang can correct me if I'm wrong, but about 1 in 6 patients have a generic variant that might affect their treatment and their management of prostate cancer. So there are now several trials that are open, that are enrolling, that are addressing these issues. So one of the things that's happening now that genetic testing is being considered in so many more patients is that there's we need somebody to convey those results, right? We need somebody to return those results. And so using telehealth and more video kind of formatting to allow to provide that in-person, that genetic counseling may be more efficient way and a way to kind of further implement genetic testing and return of results. So there's a ProGen study that is actually comparing the effectiveness of that, comparing video versus in-person genetic counseling. So then one of the reasons why we want to do genetic testing in men and healthy men is to help figure out who we need to PSA screen, like who should be screened better, because we know that PSA screening has, you know, it kind of has its downsides. And so we want to target better who we should actually screen and who may benefit from screening. So there's a study called IMPACT, which is evaluating the role of targeted PSA screening in men who have these germline variants, BRCA1 and BRCA2, which we know is associated with more aggressive prostate cancer. And finally, there's a trial called Gentlemen, which is men with metastatic prostate cancer. So these men, they can sign up to see if they have a germline variant, which might affect their, or actually a somatic variant or a germline variant, I believe, that will affect their treatment in the future. And so that's kind of free testing. So that's an example of what you can do kind of in the screening arena. So then there are trials for, you know, a lot of the trials are focused on high-risk disease, of course, because these are the patients who we're most concerned about progressing. So for localized high-risk disease, there are several different tests for somebody who might, one of the really exciting tests that we have now, you might have heard if any of you attended the general meeting, is the PSMA imaging. And I think Dr. Morgan's presented a beautiful slide where you could see the PSMA in patients who are now being treated with therapeutics that target PSMA, their tumors can just melt away. So PSMA is a very sensitive and very specific test for prostate cancer, and you can image where prostate cancer is outside of the prostate using that test. And so now we're testing using PSMA to work up and evaluate where prostate cancer has disseminated to in high-risk patients. So typically a high-risk patient may get a CT scan or a bone scan, but PSMA may be even more sensitive than that bone scan. So this is a trial, the 18DCFPYL PSMA PET trial is looking at using the PSMA to see where prostate cancer may have disseminated, and so it's maybe an improving way to image that disease and stage patients. So then also there's stereotactic body radiation therapy, or SBRT. You guys may have heard about this. So standard radiation therapy, it takes they give radiation in many doses. It can take up to 3 months sometimes to get all your doses, but SBRT is kind of they're allowed to give more bang for the buck, and so it basically only takes 2 weeks sometimes to complete the treatment. So they're now testing SBRT out in high-risk localized prostate cancer. So this is another trial that I recommend. Actually, I do recommend this one to some of my patients because we have it open at the VA. So trying SBRT for patients who are considering radiotherapy as a treatment for prostate cancer, using SBRT maybe one that's really good to try. And then there's another trial that looks at neoadjuvant treatments. So neoadjuvants meaning, in this case, looking at androgen deprivation therapy using a combination of abiraterone in addition to the traditional ADT, or plus or minus apalutamide in high-risk prostate cancer. So this is another one that's looking at, the ability to combine androgen blockade with surgery and to see if that improves outcomes in high-risk patients. So then we can go on to disease that has spread. Unfortunately, obviously, we don't like this stage, but and this is where we really want to focus our treatments. Sometimes we can determine, we want to try curative intent treatments for patients with low volume disease. We call it oligometastatic prostate cancer. So there's a limited amount of tumor that has spread outside the prostate. And as we saw from Dr. Morgan's talk, some patients respond better to certain types of therapies when they have a low tumor burden. So there's a couple of trials looking at not only treating the primary tumor, but also targeting treatments to the sites where the metastases have occurred, or have spread, to try to see if the idea is to get patients off of all hormonal therapy after 6 months and see whether or not they can maintain a response, a durable response. So this is for patients with low volume oligometastatic prostate cancer. Another trial would be combining radium-223, which is a therapeutic that can be given systemically with those targeted therapies to the disease that you can see using radiation, which is stereotactic ablative radiation therapy, that's SABR, for patients with metastatic disease, low volume metastatic disease as well. So moving on to metastatic CRPC. So we've already heard about some of the breakthroughs that have happened in treatments for metastatic CRPC, but there are still more trials that are currently recruiting, a lot more trials. This is probably the most active area of clinical trials. Basically, just to highlight 2 of these trials, there's one, everybody's interested in what combination of treatments is going to work well, so there's a really interesting trial that's looking at an immunotherapy, a checkpoint inhibitor called pembrolizumab. And so this one has a bunch of different arms, and they're trying it with olaparib, which is a targeted kind of a medication that targets patients with the BRCA mutations, or DNA damage repair mutations. There's an arm that looks at it with docetaxel, an arm that looks at it with enzalutamide or abiraterone. So it's trying to identify what combinations of treatments are really going to help, give more durable responses in men with metastatic CRPC. So again, as we're moving really more towards that personalized or precision oncology, where we're testing those tumors, just like Dr. Chang talked about so eloquently earlier, taking the tumor tissue, sequencing it, trying to identify specific mutations that may be responsive to specific therapeutic agents. So this is a study that does just that. It's called the CHOMP study. So it's looking for mutations in a gene called CDK12, which when patients have tumors with these mutations, those tumors may be more responsive to certain types of therapy. And so there's a study like that as well. So I'm going to end with this slide, which is kind of a repeat of what Dr. Morgan showed earlier. As a urologist, we're always looking at this slide. These are our guidelines that come from the National Comprehensive Cancer Network that tell us, help give us an algorithm of what should be standard of care and what we should consider in our patients with newly diagnosed disease. And as of 5 years ago, we only had one treatment for this group of hormone-sensitive metastatic patients, so newly diagnosed patients with metastatic disease. It used to be we only had one option, which is ADT, and because of clinical trials now, we have all of these new options. So now the trick is going to be, well, which one is the best, and how we sequence these. But it's great. It's great to see all of these breakthroughs and to have all these new options. So I hope that you guys can go and promote clinical trials in patients, and I know it's our mission at the VA now to really make sure every one of our patients at least knows about clinical trials and has access to at least consider a clinical trial. So thank you so much.